Hello, I am Katie Caves. I'm the director of Summits, which is the Reform Lab part of the Chair of Education Systems at ETH Zurich.
And I'm Ditila Nacho, and I'm a research assistant here at the Chair of Education System at ETH Zurich.
And today we get to talk about permeability. And permeability is super important because it is sort of this through line key topic that's going to come up whenever we're worried about skills mismatch or employers not having the skills they need on the labor market, or about things like equity and making sure that all young people have access to the education pathways and programs that they want to get to and pursue all the lifelong learning they want to have. So many skills are something we can't learn in university or we can't learn sitting in a classroom. And you really have to get practical experience. You really have to sort of learn what you're doing. And it's never going to be best to learn those in a classroom. And we want people to have an opportunity to learn those skills through formal education and training programs and get those valuable qualifications, even if they're not maybe university skills or school skills or the usual sort of reading, writing, arithmetic. So permeability is this really important topic, and it's something that comes up, and it's the problem in a lot of cases whenever we have issues like labor market integration of young people, skills mismatch, employers searching for skills that they can't find, skills gaps, things like that. And also it's really important for equity. And when people think about permeability, what do they usually think about?
I think one of the main things that people think of when they think about permeability is access and how students can start at any point in the system and then finalize their studies and at any ending point.
Right. We don't want people to run into dead ends or roadblocks or, accessibility issues where we're for some reason excluding people from a program. It's really important, but it's only half the equation. Access, if we think of it as kind of the vertical axis of things, where people can go up and up and up, but there's also a horizontal axis. We have different types of education. So we might have the academic pathway, and then we have a vocational professional pathway. You can also even have an applied pathway in the middle if you want. There's plenty of different models. And what you want to do with opportunity is make sure that there's programs all the way across the education system. So it's not just that you can go from program to program, but also that there's programs for you to go into.
So access is really a key word that people think of when they're trying to improve their system. So what they're doing is they discuss about enrollment rates or even progression routes. However, there is another element to this.
Exactly. So access is great, but if we don't have opportunity, there's nothing for people to access. So usually when we're thinking about access, we're thinking about how do I maximize who's attaining the qualifications I already have, who's getting into the programs I already have, how do I sort of get people into what's already there? When we start to talk about opportunity as well, then we're talking about where are the gaps in my education system. Can someone start in any pathway and go all the way to the highest levels of skills and qualifications in any pathway? And so often what that means is, at the vocational professional side, you'll have a qualification or a program that's at the same level as something like a PhD, but it's not a university program. And it's super important because there's so many skills that are needed by employers that young people need, that are important for innovation, and they're just not the type of skills that are learned in universities. Lots of important skills are, obviously, but not everything is best suited to be learned in a classroom.
To make the conversation about permeability a bit easier, we have come up with a very simplified model for practitioners to start the conversation about reforming their system.
So there's 7 types of systems that we've come up with. And the really simple model that we have is organized around 2 levels and 2 pathways. So the levels that we have are just secondary and tertiary. So secondary education is usually upper secondary, but in some countries it also includes lower secondary. It's kind of your age like 12 or 13 or 14 until 18 or 19. In Switzerland, that would be upper secondary education. In the United States, we'd call it something like high school, that sort of level of programs. And then the second level that we have is the tertiary level. And that includes a lot of different things. On the academic side, it's going to include like a bachelor, master, PhD. On the vocational professional side, it'll include those same levels, but not university degrees. So equivalent, but not the traditional university degrees that we're used to hearing about. So we've collapsed a lot into these levels, but it helps us sort of simplify and talk about things a lot more clearly.
Exactly. And in order to keep things very simple, we've done the same thing on the pathways. So we only have 2 pathways, the academic and applied pathway. In a lot of countries, those can be also 2 separate pathways, but just for the sake of simplicity, we've collapsed those 2 together. And we also have the vocational and professional pathway. So for example, in the academic pathway, we'll have institutions such as universities, the classic universities we know, colleges, the classic high schools, and then on the vocational and professional pathway, there are a lot of professional high schools or professional colleges and universities.
Yeah, and even sometimes there's programs like where it's just an exam at the end. So for example, the professional education and training exams in Switzerland. And when we put all those things together, we end up with some boxes and arrows. So we have 4 possible boxes. So those are the programs at the different levels. So for example, at the secondary level in the academic and applied pathway, we've got academic secondary school, high school, gymnasium, that sort of thing. At the academic tertiary level, we have our bachelor, master's, PhDs. In the vocational and professional secondary level, we have vocational education and training. In Switzerland, that's dual vocational education and training most commonly, which is sort of the apprenticeship is what some people call it. And then we have professional education and training, which is lots of different levels of more specific advanced qualifications still in the vocational professional field. And when we start to vary which boxes and arrows are available, then we arrive at 7 different permeability types. So if you have all the boxes and all the arrows, then obviously you have a fully permeable system. And this has all the good things that we talk about when we talk permeability. No dead ends. You can go from any starting point to any ending point. You know, all of those wonderful things. And basically in this context, what you just see is there are programs in all of the boxes. There's an academic secondary program, there's an academic tertiary program, same thing on the vocational professional side. And there's arrows between them. That's our access thing. So you can go from any program to any other program. You can sort of cross. And even within levels, and that's really important, especially at the tertiary level, because you might do, for example, an academic master's degree and then do a professional education and training qualification at the PhD level. So there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination, even just within one level.
And the best example that we can use for this kind of full permeable system is Switzerland, where we have both pathways that have opportunities and programs within the tertiary level as well as the secondary level, and there's a lot of different programs and exams that people can take in order to switch pathways.
Exactly, and we know from Switzerland that people use these progression routes, that a lot of people take a mixed path through the system, and because Switzerland has a fully permeable system, we can compare apples to apples when we're looking at education outcomes. And so we know things like young people who start with vocational education and training are no worse off than those who start with academic education. People who take mixed pathways through the system have some of the best outcomes. And if you really want to make sure you're employed and earning a lot of money, professional education at the highest levels is the way to go.
And if you make these pathways and the changes so easy, it's possible that the vocational and professional pathway also has a good reputation, which is very, very important.
That's super important. So what happens if you don't have all of these things? So the other permeability types, we're going to start sort of at the least permeability and work our way up. And the first type is a type that you're going to see all over the world. It's super common, and it's the academic only system. This is where we just have academic secondary education, academic tertiary education, and obviously the one arrow that progresses you from the one to the next.
Very common in a lot of places. The example that we're going to use is the United States. And the way that you can imagine this is that they're like all the formal programs are on the academic and applied pathway, and then the vocational and professional one is completely empty. This does not mean that there are no such programs in the country, however, they're not formal.
Yeah, they're not formal, they're not part of the education system. And this has 2 really big outcomes. One is, well, there's a lot of outcomes, but it has 2 really big consequences for this conversation. One of those is that you can see we're missing these vocational and professional programs at both levels, which means that young people who are progressing through the formal education system have no way to get all of those skills that would be contained in those programs. Obviously, universities kind of fill the gap to a certain degree, and you see that in really specific areas like nursing science. But there's so many things where young people just don't have a straightforward way of attaining the qualifications and skills that they need to be successful on the labor market. And you also have employers coming from the other side saying, we can't find the skilled workers that we need. The second big issue is the arrows. You'll notice that we don't have any boxes on the right side of the picture, which means we don't have all the arrows that are supposed to be there. And we also miss all the arrows that go in between the academic and vocational professional pathways. So this means that if a young person doesn't succeed at the academic secondary level, they've got no way of moving upward in the system. There's just this one arrow and we're trying to squeeze everybody up through it. So if we lose out on our opportunity, we actually lose most of our access in the process. And if we go back to the US as an example, we can see that they've got huge problems with inequality in the education system, with access to higher education, And when it comes to issues like systemic racism or helping young people who don't have sort of a privileged background succeed in the system, this kind of model is going to be sort of almost the worst case scenario.
So our third type is the dead-end VET. And this is also a very common type that we observe all around the world. What we have here, as you can see in the picture, we have vocational and professional training is only available on the secondary level. So when students are done, they have this is pretty much a dead end. They have no other opportunities to go up or continue their studies. So this makes VET in such systems a very, very isolated, which also then leads to these programs being very unpopular.
Exactly. And this is a super common model that we see. There's so many places in the world that have some kind of vocational education and training, but it's only on the secondary level. And especially now when people are starting to increase their investment in vocational education and training and realize it's a good thing and that's wonderful. But if we stop at the secondary level, then it's a dead end. And young people, when they're making their education decisions, they are looking for the program that's going to help them get the furthest in life. And if you can only get to the secondary level, and maybe you can work your way over to a university somehow, but it's going to be way harder than if you just started with academic, that's always going to be the second choice program. And it's the program for other people's children. And that's not what we want vocational education and training to be. So this model is more permeable than the academic only system, but it creates a situation where VET is a second class program. And that's certainly not what we want to see.
And to illustrate dead-end VET with one of our LELAM countries, that would be Nepal, they have VET programs only at the secondary level. And for the students that graduate from these programs, there are no other programs available. So if they would want to change to an academic, towards the academic pathway, they would have to go through the entire education system again in order for them to advance throughout the system.
That's a great example. The next type that we have adds a little bit more access to the system. So VET is still only available on the secondary level. We don't have professional education and training, but there is a way to get from vocational education and training easily into academic secondary so that you can sort of make up some extra competencies or maybe even redo the whole thing and then go from there. Or there's a challenging transition where you can actually get straight into a university. And this is better because now VET isn't completely alone on an island. You don't have to start again and redo everything, but VET is still a detour. We call this the cul-de-sac because you're not really getting anywhere. You can still turn around. There's space for you to turn around, but it's still not like a road that connects you to the next step of life. So this, again, it's more permeable, it's an improvement, but in this situation, we still have that as a second class option because it takes you more time or energy or effort or something to really get to the next level. And if you don't have all of that time and energy and effort, then it's a dead end for you. A great example of this kind of system is education systems that were influenced by British colonialism. One that springs to mind for me is Singapore. They're really working on improving their vocational education and training options. And the polytechnics are at a tertiary level and they're really doing a lot better. But for some young people, there's such a priority on going to university that often if they fail a university entrance exam, they'll go through a VET program of some kind as sort of a holding pattern until they can take the test again and hopefully make it to academic university. So it's not really serving its intended purpose as a program that helps young people access better labor market outcomes. The next type increases permeability a little bit yet again. So this one is springboard VET. So this is the situation. The difference here is that the transition from vocational education and training at the secondary level to university education is easy. So not necessarily that it's totally a given, but that there is a clear, straightforward path that young people are reliably taking. And this is a really big step because now at the very least, vocational education and training isn't a waste of time. You can use it as an equal alternative to go into university on the same timeline as your peers who did academic education. It's still not as good as a fully permeable system because ideally there's something where vocational education and training gives you an advantage, but it's certainly better than dead end and cul-de-sac.
An example that can illustrate this type is Benin, one of our LELAM countries. The majority of the vocational and professional programs in Benin are at the secondary level. There is one single program, diploma in agricultural studies that's situated in the tertiary level. However, if we have only one single program, then we cannot talk about opportunity at this level. So students in Benin, they can either go through the academic secondary or the vocational secondary, and they have the opportunity to go then continue their studies towards the tertiary academic level. However, the arrow of access, as you can see the picture, goes only to the left side. So the students that have a technical baccalaureate, they can go and attend the tertiary academic. However, if you would attend an academic high school, there are no opportunities on the tertiary vocational pathway.
Absolutely. The next example, again, getting more permeable as we move through the types. The next one is silos. This is another really common one. I feel like whenever there's a really good vocational education and training system, very often we find that it's either this type or the next type. So this is a system where we have all the boxes. There's opportunity throughout the system, which is really exciting. We have vocational education and training and professional education and training in the vocational professional pathway, and we have secondary and tertiary academic education on the academic applied side. So that's great, but the arrows, the access only goes within pathways. So you see young people, if they start in vocational, they stay vocational. If they start academic, they stay academic. Obviously, exceptions are always possible, but the main group of students is always going to be staying within their pathway. And again, this is better than the pathways before. You have the opportunity to go up. We can compare apples to apples and see that young people with a certain number of years of education are doing equally well, or maybe they're not doing as well or something. We can really start to understand the mechanics of the system here. But we still have this problem where young people can't transition. And therefore, the young people are always going to prioritize the education that they feel gives them a broader base and a wider door of opportunities that they can go through. So again, a lot of times vocational education and training becomes sort of a second-class option. It's better than the other ones, but it's still not letting vocational education and training be a really valuable start to any young person's career and lifelong learning.
Typical for this type is Chile. As you already mentioned, Chile has a very well-developed vocational and professional pathway, so they have programs available in the secondary as well as the tertiary level. Mm-hmm. And as is very often the case, transition from one pathway to the other is theoretically possible. However, it's very challenging and not a lot of people do it. And this is a very important distinction, because if something is possible in theory, but almost pretty much impossible in practice, then we just don't count it as existing.
We would never see evidence of it in international statistics that young people are actually taking the pathway. Therefore, functionally, it doesn't exist.
Exactly.
The next type builds on that a little bit. So this one is where we have difficult transitions between the different sides. So difficult transitions mean it's possible and people do it, but you have to be fairly exceptional to make it work. And so again, for most young people or for the average young person, it might still not be feasible to move from one side to the other or from one level to the next.
Here we can mention Costa Rica. They have programs in both the secondary and tertiary level of the academic and the vocational pathways, mm-hmm. and transition is possible, mostly throughout the secondary level. The problem is that the vocational programs are only offered to the bachelor students at the tertiary level. So if people want to continue their education after they have obtained a vocational bachelor, they're forced to change to the academic pathway.
So we still can't go all the way up with all of the different skills and qualifications in the system.
Exactly.
So you can see that when we put all this together, we're sort of slowly increasing the amount of permeability, and it has really important consequences for not just the equity in the system and whether young people are able to make the transitions they want and pursue the lifelong learning pathways they want. It also has consequences for the labor market and for how attractive vocational education and training is and whether it's really considered a viable option in a given country.